there are 3 dimensions to trust. And you can think of them like 3 links in a chain. The first is benevolence. So that means I feel you have my best interest at heart. And then the second is competence, which is I feel you have the skills and the motivation to get the job done. And then the third is reliability, which is you honor your word. So you do what you say you'll do. And if you can't, because of unforeseen circumstances, you still honor your word by circling back, acknowledging, making reparations when necessary. And that last one, reliability, that's the one people often think of when they think of trust, but the other 2 are just as important. And back to that chain metaphor, it's really, the weakest link in that chain is the level of your trust.
Hey, this is Zach Waters, board member of the Architectural Foundation of San Francisco and CEO at Black Swan Risk Management for Architects and Engineers. This is the Leadership Blueprint Podcast, the show where we hear stories from top design professionals with innovative ideas for running a firm, gaining clients, building team culture, and much more. So whether you're a CEO, an architect, an engineer, or an entrepreneur, you'll learn what it really means to be a leader in the design community. Thank you for coming for another episode here of the Leadership Blueprint Podcast. Today, our guest, we are lucky to have Liz Myers, who is an executive leadership coach and consultant and is the owner and CEO of Integrative Leadership Strategies. And Liz has a very unique background. So not only is she into leadership and understanding of the way teams work, she is a trained structural engineer and has a bachelor's degree from Cornell in engineering and a master's degree from Stanford in structural engineering. Incredibly qualified to be here having this conversation with us about leadership and design. So Liz, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Can we just jump right in with kind of your journey? Because we talked a little bit off camera, but obviously I just mentioned you're a trained engineer and you worked for at least a little bit as an engineer, saw a few problems kind of in the engineering world around leadership, right, around management. And then now obviously that's what you do. So Can you tell us a little bit about that, a little bit about your journey?
Yeah. So I took a job at a small consulting firm in downtown San Francisco after getting my master's, and woman-owned business, lots more women than men, I think, worked there. So it was just exciting. And the work they did was really cool. So I was excited about being there, but 6 months in, I wasn't happy. And I think a couple things were happening, right? I was coming from grad school where I was, felt like a leader and I had agency over my time to go to the bottom of the pile, really, and feeling a little bit like a minion, I would say, a little bit like my time was dictated in terms of projects. And I remember feeling like, can't you just tell me like my deadlines and let me navigate what to do when and that kind of thing. But at first I didn't even have that level of autonomy. So that was just hard and it's probably, it's just a universal thing. Maybe it is a millennial generation thing of we want autonomy over our time and we're committed to what needs to get done. But I wasn't able to kind of pick and choose tasks that aligned with my energy on any given day or a certain time of day. And the other piece, I think, that kind of drove me towards the career I have now was, I got there and I was like sort of looking around like, is this the real world? Is this what it's like? Right. Because it wasn't what I expected. Nobody was talking. There was like the click, click, click of the keyboard and no humanness,
right?
Or at least not to the extent that I expected.
Right.
And in grad school, like so much of you have your schoolwork and you work hard at it, but the friend connections and the conversations with professors, it's all about that inspired connections. So There was a lack of, one of my mentors calls it eros, just that like human to human connection. So I was just like, really? Hello, people. And I remember even my first day at work, I didn't pack a lunch because I didn't know what to expect, but lunchtime rolled around and the guy next to me went and got his lunch and worked at his desk and nobody else said anything. I was like, okay, see you guys later. I'm going to go get some food. And, I guess I had an expectation that there would be somebody wanting to get to know me on that first day at lunchtime. And my manager, I found myself paying attention to
Mm-hmm.
her style, emotional health, the way she interacted with me and others, and then the effect that had on my morale. Like if she came in the morning and walked by my cubicle and didn't say a word, put her bag down, put her coat down, and then went to the manager's office next to her and said, "Hey, how was your weekend?" That impacted me negatively. I felt like, what about me? Do I not matter just because I'm the lower level of worker? Really? And so there were things
so
like that.
important.
Yeah.
Right. Real quick, let's just pause on that. That is so incredibly important. I have a story very similar to that. I started a job, and the first day I was supposed to have lunch with the president of the company, who I had interviewed with. I knew him. And I got a text message the day before I started my job saying, "Hey, that's not going to work. He's traveling." And so I showed up, and nobody knew what to do with me on the first day. This was not my first job out of college. Like, this was not an entry-level job. And I show up, and there's nobody there. And like, I show up at 9 a.m. That's what we had agreed upon. And nobody really, and I kind of sit in the lobby, and then I come in, and they're like, well, I mean, your office is over there. You can go sit over there. And I sit there, and I'm just like, what is happening right now?
Right.
And I had that same lunch, I had a lunch planned, and I thought somebody else was going to, go with me. And I ended up eating by myself, at a pretty expensive restaurant in downtown Oakland, just like unconnected, right? Feeling disconnected.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what we're getting at is there's an underestimate of how much the sense of belonging feeds into somebody's willingness to work hard.
Right.
So I noticed that. I noticed her style, and I noticed just people skills or lack thereof and dynamics in the office, and eventually tying that with my boredom of the work itself. I realized, okay, if my attention and energy is going towards these things, that may be a clue that's where my purpose is. So I went on a journey looking for, well, how could this attention to these dynamics be a career? And I found coaching, and that was great because I could get trained and kind of on the side and make that transition work logistically for me.
Right.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
So when you're doing your consulting now, is it exclusively with design firms, or is it kind of open to anybody?
I don't limit it. And the people who tend to be attracted are technical, I would say, not necessarily just design. So biotech, manufacturing, there's some decommissioned nuclear sites. So people who appreciate that my training included engineering. And so my brain is sort of naturally trained to look at how these pieces fit together and kind of have that systems perspective.
Gotcha. And so when you're walking into a firm, do you normally find kind of that environment that you found your very first job, which is this kind of quiet, maybe, people aren't talking, all you're hearing is the strokes of the keyboard? Is that common when you're going to work with a client?
Symbolically common, I would say, in the sense that people aren't people aren't saying to each other the things that really need to be said.
Okay.
Yeah. By the time I actually show up on site, which hasn't happened in a while now with the pandemic.
Right.
By the time I show up on site, I have a contact who has kind of explained the dynamics. And so a lot of my consulting work centers around team dynamics. So the team isn't gelling in the way it needs to. It doesn't know how to build alignment, or people are working at cross purposes and undermining each other in subtle ways and those kinds of things. Gotcha.
And so what would be the first thing, without obviously giving away all your secrets, what would be the first thing that you would have a client do, or a team, if you're going to go work with, an engineering firm who understands they're having some issues with communication, some issues with culture, where would you start?
That's a great question. And I give a lot of thought to how can I enter into this culture and system and team system in a way that I don't get rejected. Because if I'm here to teach them or shepherd them to a new normal, it can be scary to have someone come in and try to quote unquote fix things. So I'm mindful of that. And I work with whoever my contact usually is around setting the context. So usually we'll have some sort of project kickoff meeting where that person who brought me in tells everybody why they did that and what they're thinking. And it's transparent up front. And then after that, I basically act like I have a blank slate and I kind of temporarily forget everything I was told about why I was brought in and start over with the whole team about what do you want to do and what do you think's needed. And granted, there's some scope or boundaries around it, like maybe the mandate is team formation or team cohesion. So within that frame, what would help this team be more cohesive? And so I'll just put that back to the team and really, so my philosophy is very collaborative in the sense of my job is to elicit from the team the answers that they think would serve.
Gotcha.
And I sprinkle in some training here and there on what does it take to build trust and how do we actually do dialogue where we get really to a higher collective intelligence as a group than any of us have individually.
Right.
But those are just tools that help them basically develop their own solutions.
Okay. So it sounds like step one is people need to be able to have a voice and feel heard. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yep. That's obvious to me and paradigmatic to how I work. I don't like to say it that way, but yes.
Well, and it's funny. I mean, we were talking a little bit off camera about, Simon Sinek and some things that he does. I'm a huge fan of Start With Why, which is, I think, his first book, but he also does a lot around leadership, Leaders Eat Last. And that idea, especially for new employees, right? Like, so when you talked about your initial, your first job in engineering, that idea that you should just sit in the corner and speak when spoken to and just do your work and you haven't put in your time yet and your thoughts and your ideas are not relevant yet is a terrifying idea. And it's still, I think, it's not as common as it used to be, but I still think there are shades of that left behind. And I think the exact opposite of that is what you're getting at, which is if you can tell somebody that your opinion matters, right? I understand that you're new here. I understand that maybe you don't fully comprehend everything that's going on, but you're an intelligent individual, right? Like if you're an engineer by definition, you have a reasonable amount of intelligence just to be able to get through the schooling. If you're, I value your opinion. And if you come to me and say, something that I was thinking this, or I thought maybe we could do a better way of that, right? If you're a manager and you reject that, that's a very quick way to break trust with somebody, right? And that trust, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know that's kind of that sounded like step one was you need to go in as a consultant and build trust with the team. Is there a way now that you can start to get the team to build a little bit more trust either in themselves and or in a management? Yeah,
definitely. So the model I use for trust comes from an academic paper by Shepard and Sherman. And basically it says that there are 3 dimensions to trust. And you can think of them like 3 links in a chain. The first is benevolence. So that means I feel you have my best interest at heart. And that we're going to operate, if it's a mutual thing, right? We're going to operate with each other's best interest at heart. And that's, you may have that, but are you communicating that you have that? And then the second is competence, which is I feel you have the skills and the motivation to get the job done. So both of those, the skills and the motivation. And then the third is reliability, which is you honor your word. So you do what you say you'll do. And if you can, because of unforeseen circumstances, you still honor your word by circling back, acknowledging, making reparations when necessary. And that your behavior is predictable and consistent enough that you can be trusted in high stakes situations. And that last one, reliability, that's the one people often think of when they think of trust. But the other 2 are just as important. And back to that chain metaphor, it's really, the weakest link in that chain is the level of your trust. It's going to break with it, whatever is that weakest link. So when I go with a team, I have a certain way of running meetings to engage people and to have those voices in the room and to lay everything out explicitly so that they can see here's what we're doing. Here's our motivation. Here's the outcomes we're going for. And that addresses benevolence. It addresses competence at some level, that they can see what I am doing and what my role is and what I'm bringing, and reliability too, because we're going to do what we say we're going to do in this meeting design that we've got together.
That's so important. I love this, by the way. This is the way that you just framed this. I took these notes down, and I was thinking of a scenario where, I remember where I heard it, but it was somebody that put competence and or ability on a graph. So one axis was competence and the other axis was trust. And they were interviewing, I think it was military. I want to say it was like Navy SEALs. And they said, look, if we draw a line, and obviously this person down here that has neither trust nor ability, nobody really wants to work with that person, understandably. If you draw a line all the way, increase both. Everybody wants to work with a person who is highly trustworthy and highly skilled, has ability. That makes sense too, right? We understand those two things. Where people were a little interested to hear was that the Navy SEALs would rather work with somebody who was of moderate ability but high trustworthiness over somebody who was of extreme ability and lacking trustworthiness, right? Because when you're a military person, when you're out on a mission and your life depends on the people next to you, trust is all you really have, right?
Right.
I need to know that you're good. I really do, and hopefully, and we train and drill those things, but I really need to know that you've got my back. And if I can't trust you, they said they wouldn't, if that really, really incredible person that was untrustworthy, they said you can find that person in every office. And for lack of a better term, you go ask the staff, who's the asshole? And everybody can point to that person and say, and that's, that's the person in corporate America. We think that bonuses themselves over their team. Right.
Yeah.
And it's so sad. It's so unfortunate. Right.
Yeah. And you just gave a clue to kind of one of the antidotes is deep sense of self-worth and confidence, so that your ego can kind of take a chill pill and you can be more of a servant leader,
right, in
the workplace.
I love that idea of servant leadership. When we said trust and you're like, well, that makes just so much sense to me, right? That's just the building blocks of where we're at. Servant leadership makes so much sense to me. And yet I don't think it's as popular an idea as it should be. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. And I think this may be more true, and I'm speculating here, but in technical fields where the leaders tend to have more experience, so they have that content expertise. So then they're like, why would I act in service of people below me when I've been around the block and they haven't? But what we're talking about is kind of followership as one of the key ingredients to your leadership. And you can do that. You may have content expertise, but the process is another whole piece that is often left implicit, that the people who report to you would love to have some say in. Team, how do you want to handle this situation, and letting that be the place where you're a servant leader. And any time you have more knowledge than them in the technical realm, you throw that in there. But it's not something that needs to cause a leader to hoard power.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it really goes to win-win mindset, because the idea that I can let these other people win, it doesn't mean I have to lose. It means I share the love. We all come together and decide. And that freaks some leaders out, because they're like, well, if I solicit everyone's opinion, now I'm going to have however many on the team, 6 opinions I have to coalesce. How do you even do that? And that's kind of a very specific skill set in finding what Roger Martin calls the third alternative. He wrote a book called The Opposable Mind, which I really like. But finding that third alternative when you find yourself stuck in two opposing things as if they're fighting a tug of war. What is the third alternative? And it's a skill set that you can cultivate.
Right. It's so important, I think, to think of leadership as a skill set and not as a is a natural ability, either that you have it or you don't. Right? It's a very fixed mindset, right?
Yeah.
Because I believe in this technical world, right? You spend all of these years in school training, as you should, right? There's no doubt about that. But the scary thing, I think, is that you can spend all this time learning the technical side of the profession, get so good at that you get promoted, and then now you're in a leadership role, and maybe you haven't even spent 1 hour or 1 day learning the skill set of leadership. Is that, do you see that fairly often?
Yeah. Well, I just resonate with what you said about it. It really is a skill that can be learned. And I would say it starts with one's personal foundation of, are you in integrity with yourself? Like what, are you authentic with what you need throughout your day? Are you owning and being honest and, living by the values that you have, basically? And if that personal foundation is not solid, how would we expect anybody to show up for others and in that kind of leader as shepherd kind of a way?
Okay.
And then on top of that, there are skills for how do you find the third alternative and how do you engage a group of people in a process and learning to make things explicit that you might just take for granted, pieces of information that you might just take for granted.
When you're working with a firm, when you go in and you're doing your consulting, is your goal to leave behind, is it to leave behind a program or a framework, or is that kind of up to the firm itself in terms of how they want to build? I guess it kind of, what is a way that you can interject a leadership type program if we understand that there's not a lot of training going on out there in the design world, and that it's really up to individual firms to create this? What is the best way for them to create and perpetuate the skills of leadership?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. They have to decide sort of what their philosophy is going to be, I suppose, around leadership, right? We talked offline a little bit about command and control leadership, and that kind of, it's had its moment and we're evolving. Maybe the millennials are going to bring this about for good, evolving towards a more servant leadership, collaborative leadership style. So I think for a company to decide, like, what does this look like for us, and how do we actually live by what we're saying? And then in terms of bringing a consultant in, for me, I have 3 basic ways that I go in and help. And one is individual leadership coaching. And that's really working on that personal foundation and personal mastery and building awareness around how one is showing up. The second is consulting. And usually there's an explicit problem, right, that the client wants to solve in consulting. And so things like leadership offsites where the team needs to kind of reconnect and gel more and build more trust. Yeah. And sometimes, let me just go to the third one, which is training. And that would be more of initiatives where webinars on trust or how to actually collaborate and things like that. And those are, just a webinar in and of itself is probably not going to change a lot, but it's a nice way to plant a seed that can, with cultivation, sprout over time. It's a nice way to kind of give the whole culture something at once.
Right. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I know that is a popular idea of like doing an offsite, right? So you're a new leader, you've been promoted up into a firm, and you do an offsite for a day or a weekend or whatever it is. And then you come back and now you're a leader. Right. It's like, well, okay, there's a lot more to learn. This is this is a practice, right? It's a mindset. It's a lot of things. It's not a pass or fail, and you weren't one yesterday and you are one, tomorrow. But that idea that you're planting seeds, right? It's building awareness. It is putting those things in front of you on a daily basis. And that's how you kind of change ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And the offsites, like when I do an offsite, it's a 3-phase experience. And I just got off one with an executive leadership team, but I tell them, I'm not just going to show up at an offsite, dump some stuff on you, have some nice conversations and then leave, because is that really going to change anything? So I am very focused on making the rubber meet the road and facilitating the team in its real work, and not just doing fun standalone team
Right.
building exercises.
Right.
Yeah, stuff like that. Right. Which I think, raises people's skepticism and like, it's a little cheesy. It's just not my style. But
sure.
So we tend to do 3 phases where there's the lead-in phase where I engage the team and what do you want in an offsite and what would be worth it for you and where are the problems you see that we should address at this juncture. And then I design the offsite and they have a chance to push back and review it. And so before we ever even get to offsite or on Zoom nowadays, they know exactly what's happening, exactly why. They've come to get to know me and how I can serve. So that's awesome. And then we do the work. And sometimes it's strategic planning. Sometimes it's dialoguing about team dynamics, whatever they think they need in that way. And then there's a 3rd phase of integration. Like, how is this going to come back to our daily work? And what does that look like? So I usually support teams in coming back to their typical leadership meetings and kind of bringing some of these concepts back to that place. Because the leadership meetings that occur regularly are a great just touch point for them. That is the way that they be a team together. And then like what you were saying, you can layer these different services on. Coaching could happen after that as a way to continue to integrate and think about it. But at the end of the day, like if someone's thinking about their leadership and studying leadership and practicing, then they're probably on the right path. It's the people I worry about, the leaders I worry about who are in leadership positions and never think about it.
Right. Terrifying.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, one last question for you here, and then we'll let you go. I affectionately call it the Simon Sinek millennial question.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually applies to, I think, both of us as we are both technically elder millennials, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I know you've written on the topic, you've got a white paper out there. And the question is essentially this: Simon Sinek, Start With Why, is often asked the question, which is, this generation that is called millennials is considered difficult to work with. Some people say lazy, some people say entitled. He addresses all this in a great clip on the internet. If you want to go check it out, just go YouTube Simon Sinek Millennial. But can you talk a little bit about that? If a firm was going to come to you and management says, oh God, we've got these young folks and they're just not, they don't have it, they're lazy, they're entitled. Where would you go with something like that?
Yeah. Well, if they just said that, man, that would be a tough entry, but, but I would wonder, I need to hear both sides of this first. And my sense is, and I'm biased because I am a millennial, but my sense is it's scary for older generations, perhaps, to say, what do we do with this? People who demand engagement, basically. Mm-hmm. Especially if they don't have the skill set on how to engage, or they have limiting beliefs on the value of engagement of like, this is just going to waste our time. I already know what we need to do. Why do we need to have a meeting to hear from everybody? If they worded it the way you did, then I would think there's probably a trust problem. And we could work on that. We could have some rich dialogue and maybe even get to a place where we're delivering really valuable feedback to each other about how we're showing up. Right. Because one thing is true about millennials, sorry to cut you off, is they want to grow. They crave development.
They do. And here's how this question was posed to me in a bunch of different interviews that I've done. It doesn't come off as they're lazy, they're entitled, they're this. It comes off as, I am a firm owner of a certain age, 55, 60, getting closer to retirement, want to perpetuate my firm. And nobody is willing to work hard enough to take this over. I've tried to find so many people and they're just not up to the task. And then I go talk to a completely different firm with completely different views. And they're like, oh my God, we have so many young people who are young and hungry and willing to do this, right? And that says to me, there's a disconnect somewhere, right? Because those are two firms in the same industry that are talking about folks completely differently, right? They're talking about young folks. One of them is saying this, they're not up to the task. They're not, they don't work hard enough. They're not hungry. I hear that sometimes. And yet here you and I are talking, and I think that's absolutely not true. Mm-hmm.
What I'm tempted to guess about the situation is that millennials see the value in having balance in their lives and having a life outside of work, and how that feeds back into doing a better job. So That's my guess. And I remember my first manager made kind of lightly joking, made fun of me for being Mrs. Extracurricular. That's what she called me because I was taking an investing class at night. And it wasn't until she made that comment that I realized, oh, like the culture here, you just put your head down, do your work. Like for me to admit that I'm interested in investing when I'm supposed to be doing engineering. And then later it was a psychology class. Until she made that joke, I was like, what? Like, of course I would do these other things. I'm a lifelong learner. Exactly. What do you mean?
A growth mindset. I want to continue to learn.
Yeah. So I wonder if that's kind of what it's about.
Gotcha. That would make sense. And so I think that's hopefully our listeners can really kind of take that in and look at it through a lens of kind of self-assessment, right? What are my views on this? What am I bringing to the table?
Yeah. And one clue is, how are people reacting to me?
Right.
Or if you're not getting the response you want, if things are frustrating, it's a clue that you're not seeing the whole picture.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Liz, well, that's a great place for us to leave it right there. Where can our listeners find you on social media or internet or otherwise?
Yeah, we covered a lot of topics. This was fun. My website is integrative-leadership.com. So that's integrative, IVE at the end. And then I believe I'm linkedin.com/Liz-Myers.
Awesome. Liz, thank you.
Happy to connect there.
Absolutely. Yeah. This was spectacular. I think this is something that a lot of people need to hear, and really, really glad that you could lay this down and just put a little bit of framework around it, right? There's a lot of ideas out there, but I really love, you've got some just bullet points here. This is how you want to think about it. And that helps people a lot.
Yeah. And because we touched on so many topics, if anyone wants to go deeper and learn more, then just reach out to me.
All right, Liz. Well, you have a great morning. Thanks again for being here. For our listeners, Liz Myers, Integrative Leadership Strategies. She is absolutely excellent at what she does.
Thanks
so much, Liz.